I'm going to go ahead and get started with some of our questions. Okay, Katie and Heather, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us today. We're really thankful that you were able to take the time to come and do this webinar. And we just wanted to start by getting a little bit of your background information. Just, tell us about your professional educational backgrounds, and then we'll jump into a little bit more of the story of how y'all met and started working on this project.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. It's really a joy and pleasure to be here with all of you and with Heather. I'm Katie Rogstad, and I am a mom of 5. I homeschooled my kids for many years. I got a biology degree from Caltech and a master's degree in biochemistry from Loma Linda University. And during both those programs, I had a lot of experience doing research and writing grants and writing papers. But my first love is really teaching, and that's what I wanted to do. I had a job teaching high school chemistry and physics right out of my master's degree, but then found out I was pregnant with my first child and made a decision to stay home and homeschool. And so eventually homeschooled all 5 of my children through 5th grade. And during all those years, spent time teaching at different homeschool co-op situations for middle school and high school, in friends' houses and church kitchens. So I'm sure many of you are in these same types of situations. I taught chemistry, biology, physical science for middle school. And it wasn't, it was during that time that reviewing some of these curriculums and teaching out of them, I found something lacking in what current homeschool curricula choices were. And this dream was just planted in me to maybe someday write something that would kind of be really rigorous in harmonizing science and faith. So that dream was born many years ago. I had no idea how it would ever happen. A few years back, I was at a homeschool conference and was speaking to another homeschool mom turned curriculum author who I found really inspiring, and she connected me to Novare, and found out that they were needing an author to write a biology textbook. And since that was my background, that seemed to be a really good opportunity. It did take a few years in the making before I was ready to jump on that bandwagon, but it's been an awesome journey. I'm now teaching at a Christian school, a very large Christian school. I teach using Novare textbooks. I'm teaching physical science, and that journey has been going on kind of concurrent with the writing. So being a Novare teacher and writing to that style has kind of really worked well together. It was a very difficult undertaking, as many of you can imagine, juggling being a mom of 5 and teaching and writing this textbook. And so very early on, I asked for help, and I asked if there would be another co-author that could come on board. So that's where my story intersects with Heather's. So I'll pass the mic to her.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so my name's Heather Ayala. A little bit about myself. I'm a mother of 4. We homeschool our children, my husband and I do. I did my undergraduate work at Azusa Pacific University in California, where I got my bachelor's of science in biology. And then I went to the University of Notre Dame to pursue my PhD. My goal was to teach at the college level, and so you have to have the PhD to do that. So I pursued that. My research was then working on the parasite that causes malaria. And then after that, I was able to find a position teaching at a small college. And I've been at several colleges throughout the country. My first was just a 1-year stint in Elmhurst, which is outside Chicago. I spent some time at Bethel College in Indiana, George Fox University in Oregon, 1 year in Wyoming Catholic College, and now hopefully staying put for a while at Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. So where I am associate professor of biology and also the chair of the biology department. But yeah, in terms of getting into the writing, being a college professor, one of the things that I see a lot, especially these small Christian schools, is that we get these wonderful homeschooled families and students coming in, and they're really great students in writing and thinking, but oftentimes math and science is a struggle for them because they just haven't had the opportunity to have really robust programs there. And so my thought always was, man, wouldn't it be great if we could have a biology science curriculum that would help prepare these students for the college experience? And what's out there was either very secular and all kind of written from the point of view of evolution is everything, and we're just going to look at biology through that lens, without any nod to a creator and God. And or the other alternative that I saw a lot was, we're going to give God the spotlight, which is a great thing to do, but what ended up happening is those texts are maybe a little bit lacking in terms of the rigor. And so how can we blend the two? So I also, like Katie, kind of had this dream of, well, maybe someday I can write a text, and was hoping to do that. When I got to North Carolina, my husband and I got connected with some families that were part of a high school co-op, teaching one day the students and then doing the rest kind of remotely. And they were using Novare for the chemistry and the physical science. And one of the moms said, well, I heard they're looking for an author for their biology text. If you want to write a text, maybe you should contact them. And I thought, oh gosh, I don't know. That seems like a really big step. But I went ahead and reached out to John Mays, who, as probably many of you know, is the kind of editor, overseer of the science part of Novare, started Novare. He said, well, actually, we already have an author for general biology, but it would be great if you wanted to review the text. I thought, okay, sure. And within a week or two, he emailed me back and said, actually, our author is feeling a little overwhelmed and would love to have someone come alongside and help out. Would you be interested? I said, sure. So that kind of started this partnership, and it's been really neat. Katie, I haven't met personally, physically, but we've done a lot of Zoom calls and phone calls and exchanges of emails, and so have really got to know each other pretty well through that journey, which has been really, really fun. So.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that?
Just wanted to add that it's been a really almost miraculous kind of partnership, because it turns out that our backgrounds are really complementary. Biology is such a huge subject, and I'm more of a chemist, and so I've kind of taken over the molecular chemical side of biology, and Heather's expertise more in the ecology and organismal biology has really, it's been just a perfect match in writing this textbook.
Great. Yes, we're so excited about that partnership. Okay, let's jump into our next question, which is if you could tell us a little bit about what sets this program apart from other general biology programs that people may be familiar with already.
You should go first, Heather.
Okay, sounds good. We'll kind of go back and forth. I mean, we kind of started to maybe breach that a little bit. Apart from just Novare's kind of goals, which my understanding is that John Mays will be kind of talking more specifically about that in another webinar, so I'll save that. But specifically in terms of the biology, our overarching goal was really to have something that was rigorous, that would prepare students well, give them a really good understanding of biology, but also to really honor and acknowledge that we have a creator God who made the earth, and just the amazing intricacies that are there, and to really put the praise where praise is due, you could say, without the watering down the actual science. And so I think that was really the overarching goal. We've had conversations kind of throughout, well, what was the purpose? And I know one of the things that came up was saying, well, the creation has a purpose. Like, there's an end to the created world. Even if it's simply to make more cells or to make more plants or something of this sort, as well as giving glory to God. So that was kind of the overarching framework. And Katie, do you have other things you want to add?
Yeah, so that's the big picture. There's just some more features of this book that I think are really great. One of them is the way we set up the chapters, how it's a logical flow. We go from small to big. We start out with what is life, first of all, and then starting from atoms into molecules, into biomolecules, and then as each chapter moves on, it builds on itself. And so it's not just one topic, separated from other topics. Everything is really interconnected and embedded, one topic to the next. And so I think that's a really good way to learn biology. I remember as a student myself being really overwhelmed when I first started biology, even crying on my first day of homework because it was too much information that wasn't interconnected, and it was too much to just absorb all at once. And And so I think the way that we set this book up really sets students up for success in a logical flow and interconnectedness. Also, just giving credit where credit is due, John Mays did a lot of work on this in terms of the illustrations, and they're just gorgeous illustrations. And I think that's something that sets this book apart from maybe other homeschool books out there on the market. Also, it's shorter than other books that are out there. They're about 420 pages before the appendix. So there's really a digestible amount of material in this book for students to really master.
I'll just add one more thing. As Katie was talking, I thought about a lot of the textbooks I end up using in the college setting, the secular books, they always, in the featuring of evolution as kind of the main theme, they stick that right in the middle as if it's the summit of everything. And so we, in organizing the text, the building, but we actually chose to put that at the end for a few different reasons. One is we didn't want it to be the central focus of the book. We recognize it's a very important topic and controversial, and there's a lot of questions surrounding that, so we didn't want to ignore it. But we also didn't want it to be the key feature. So we put it at the end for that reason, for one, but also two, we wanted students to have gone through the rest of the curriculum, that they really understood the science, because it does connect so many other aspects of science and of the biology, that we thought to really dive into that question and to think about it critically, they needed to first have seen really the rest of the biology in some way, shape, or form. So that's at the end, and we know there'll be people out there who don't want to teach that, and that's okay, which makes it kind of convenient then too, because we just didn't get there, you know, or something of that sort. So that was a strategic move as well.
Thank you. Those are some great answers, and we'll get into some of those things a little more specifically as we go through the webinar. We'll kind of break some of that stuff down. We're going to talk more specifically in a few minutes about the structure of the book, the chapters, the way they're organized, and then we're going to have Heather and Katie go through each a chapter and how they would teach it, and give you some practical tips on how that might look in a 5-day-a-week class, or in a class where you're only meeting maybe once a week. So we'll give you some tips on that in a few minutes. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and jump now to the different components of the general biology program. So if you could describe the different materials that we have available and how those each work together, what their roles are.
Sure. All right. Well, I'll jump on that. So overall, there's kind of 3 components.
Looks like, oh, there you are. You froze for a second. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Can you start over?
Yeah. Okay. So here's the textbook, and this is the meat and potatoes of the program. This is the beta version, but the real hardback version will be coming out very soon. So this has the student questions, all the text, all the illustrations, objectives that the students are responsible for learning, and then to supplement that, we have the supplemental material. So it used to be distributed on CD. Now I believe it's a digital download, but that has the teacher resources. So there will be a lesson list if you want kind of guidance in how to pace things. Of course, you're not bound to that. There's also weekly quizzes and chapter tests that are part of that, and answers. If you're not as familiar with the material, that would give you guidance. And then the third part, which we're really excited about, is called the Apprentice's Companion to Biology, and that's the lab manual. And we're in progress with that. The first few chapters are available for digital download right now. But that will be the student not workbook. It's much more than that. It's a place for them to keep their data. It's a place for them to make notes, and they're just beautiful illustrations. And it has all the instructions for doing the labs. And then there's a separate teacher component to that as well that shows you the results, expected results, and other things like that.
I think you covered it, Katie. I don't know there's much more for me to add.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a great description. And again, we'll get into a little bit more of that. We're going to talk about the Apprentice's Companion in some more detail in a few minutes. And we're actually going to throw the text up on the screen here so you can see it. That will be available next year as a printed book, but this year it's going to be digital, and it, as Katie mentioned, has several chapters already available on our website at classicalacademicpress.com for digital download. But yes, meant to be it's sort of a commonplace book, a place for collecting data, a place for actually reading the instructions for experiments. It's a really interesting resource. Let's go ahead and do our chapter walkthrough. So I'm excited about this. We always, in every webinar, get a lot of questions about, how do we teach this exactly, or what might this look like in a 1 day a week class setting, a homeschool, a 5-day-a-week class. So we are going to kind of demonstrate that for you, but we're going to go through, Katie and Heather are each going to talk about a different chapter that they each authored and kind of walk us through what that might look like. Who wants to start?
See, I can start if you want. I don't want to hog it. I am going to talk about chapter 1. So that might, I don't know, make sense in context. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this is the digital version of the textbook. And so it has these little colory things on there that are a printing thing, but that won't be in the printed version. So I'm going to start here. This is in the front material of the book, and it's called the Standard Questions List. And what this is kind of like your standards, or the almost catechism of biology that the student should learn over the course of the year. So in each chapter, there are these different questions that the student should really almost commit to memory. And those differ from the objectives in the beginning of each chapter in that they're more concise. So I'm going to scroll through now to get you to the beginning of chapter 1. So this is a chapter that I wrote. It begins with an opener. It has an interesting image and a story behind it. And then we come to the objectives. So these objectives are kind of the less condensed version of the standard questions list. And that's what the student should learn. And then we have different sections here. So I'd say, as a rule of thumb, that you'd want to maybe devote 2 to 3 weeks per chapter. I'd say maybe more 3 weeks. And many of the chapters have 3 sections. So that kind of is nice for dividing up the work. And then we have the text here. So I would, take a chunk of it to go through over a week, say. And how I structure my class here at school, and what John Mays would say, is that you should give a regular assessment. So like a weekly quiz. I give my students a quiz every Friday. And that quiz should be cumulative, so that one of the questions would maybe go back to the beginning, and that standard questions list gives you really good place to draw those quiz questions from. And of course, we give you sample quizzes as well, but for myself, I like to kind of personalize it. So whatever I taught my class that week, I give them the questions of what we covered that week plus past stuff. Okay, so in chapter 1, we start out right at the beginning with what is science, which is a great way to start. What is truth? Truth is different from facts. Truth is something that like in the Declaration of Independence, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. A truth should be self-evident, something that, like, God created the world is a truth. Whereas in science is not meant to determine truth, though we'd hope to get closer to the truth, but it's not possible to know the whole truth about how the created world works. And in that case, we have to move on to facts. Facts are things that are measurable, say like the temperature outside is a fact, my height is a fact, something that you can use the tools of science to determine. And then we get into what is a theory and the cycle of scientific enterprise. Well, a theory is the best explanation for a set of facts that we have at present. And the important thing to note is that a theory could change over time, because science is always moving forward. We have better technology over time. And so that's really how we approach evolution too. We'll get to that later, but right off the bat, we talk about theories because everything in science and in biology should be looked at according to what is a theory and what is a truth. The truth never changes, theories will change. Okay, so this is the first part of the chapter. This what's it called? A scheme right here is very important, and it shows up in a lot of Novare textbooks. So I would spend a lot of time with students on this. We talk about instruments and measurement. So this would be a great time to introduce the microscope to students. And in the Apprentice's Companion, we have several microscope exercises to get them used to using this as a tool. We talk about different types of microscopy, light microscope, scanning electron microscope, transmission electron microscope, and the kind of images that they make. We talk a little bit about the metric system, although we sort of assume that students have had that in the past, and if they haven't, there's more information in the appendix. But there are facets of the metric system that are very specific to biology, such as the micron. So there's a lot of explanation as to what that is. And then we get into what is life. So there's a lot of time spent on that. And a distinctive here is we talk about purpose, and that's going to differentiate this book from a more secular textbook. So there's criteria for life, and this is pretty standard. And an overview of the cellular structure and levels of organization, meaning you start with an atom and then you get to a bigger and a bigger and a bigger level of organization until you eventually get to the whole Earth, which is the biosphere. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but you'd probably spend a week on the scientific method and the cycle of scientific enterprise, another week on what is life. You can get into a lot of detail here, and at the end of that week, you give a quiz in a classroom setting. And each of these sections has questions at the end of the chapter, and they're all at the end, but I would assign them in the middle. So in one practice I do in my class, everybody's different, but I assign homework weekly so that students, I don't grade the homework for correctness, but for completeness. Okay, so there's a whole lot of material, as you can see here. This is all about the criteria for life and how there's this hierarchy. Okay, now the third section of chapter 1 is what we call a historical sequence. And there's a number of these in the text where it's the history of a particular theory over time. And so this is the theory of spontaneous generation. In other words, where does life come from? We don't hold to that theory anymore, but that's usually what it's called in textbooks. And so you can see there's pictures of different scientists here, what their theories were over time, and how they viewed, does life come from mud? Does it just start on its own? Where does life come from? And also talks about the experiments that some of these scientists actually did to show, well, actually, maggots don't come from rotting meat. They came from the eggs that flies laid on top of the rotting meat. So life comes from life, in other words. And this is really nice because it integrates so well with the cycle of scientific enterprise. So what I might do after I've gone through this historical sequence is then cycle back to the concept of the cycle of scientific enterprise and say, okay, well, what was Needham's theory here? What was his theory, and how did it change when the next scientist came along and did an experiment to disprove it or to make it stronger? And so that's a real great opportunity for integration there. And then there's these special features, we call them interesting. And so that's just kind of an enrichment throughout the text, not necessarily to be assessed. And then here are the exercises at the end. So you can see there's a number of questions here. You may choose to assign all of them or not all of them. Sometimes I'll do this in class. I might have the student read for homework, and then we have a very short discussion at the beginning, and then we work through these questions in class. It's sort of a class discussion. So that's pretty much how I would run a chapter. And then at the high school level, at the end of a chapter, there would be like a more substantial chapter exam to sum up this whole content, whereas the weekly quizzes are just shorter. And yeah, oh, one more thing, not at the end of chapter 1, but at the end of every other chapter, there will be review questions at the end that will take you back to previous chapters and integrate previous knowledge with the knowledge that you just learned. So it's not just rote rehashing previous content, it's really integrating it with the current content. Okay, so I'll stop there and pass the baton to Heather.
All right, so let me then share my screen here. I can get it to come up for me. So my kind of background, I'm a college professor by day, so I give lectures 2 or 3 times a week in a much shortened, condensed form than you would for a high school. But I've also been involved in our local high school homeschool co-op, which meets once a week. And so it's a different presentation style because unlike in a classroom, you're not meeting every single day, but you still want to try and get through all the material, or at least most of the material in the year. So how do you do that? And again, people are going to do this differently, but the way that I've chosen to kind of do that is put quite a bit of responsibility on the student. So prior to meeting as a group, they would be given a reading assignment where they would need to go through and read a portion of a chapter. The chapters are divided up into subsections. You probably saw that as Katie was scrolling through. And so, you know, okay, read section 7.1. And I have them do an outline to, again, try and get them to engage with that text, not just read through it to read through it, but to actually write out an outline, which they would then turn in for a completion grade, just so I know that they've read it. Other techniques one could use, you could ask guiding questions for that pre-reading. You could do a pre-reading quiz just to see how much they're retaining. You could have them write down things like what they found interesting or what they knew or what they didn't know, but just some way that they're engaging with that text initially so that when they come into that once a week lecture, it's not all completely new information to them. So I will have this year 1 hour with those students, just 1 hour a week, at which point I'll go through the lesson and explain things a little bit more detail. And hopefully that helps clarify comments for them. So that's kind of what I've prepared here. Now we're kind of jumping in the middle of a text, in the middle of a chapter. So bear with me in the sense that you may not know what we talked about last week, so to speak. But a good thing that I always try and do with my classes is to review some of the concepts we did talk about in the previous meeting, just to, again, make those connections because science and biology do build. So this section I pulled is from chapter 7. This particular section is dealing with vaccines. And so we review, well, first of all, what is a virus, which was actually in section 7.1. And so, you know, posing that question to the students, seeing what they can remember, recall, describe, explain. This could be an oral exercise, or again, it could be a quiz type thing, or just have them write it down, right? There's different ways to do that. Describe the structure of a virus. Again, something we would have talked about before. This is the figure from the text that I pulled out, so you could review and kind of discuss those points. How does the immune system respond to pathogens, to viruses? Again, this is something that was covered previously in the text. I didn't go and find the exact figure, but this is one very similar to what we have in the text. And so talking about how when a pathogen enters the body, our immune system responds to that to fight it off. That first time, it's a very usually smaller response, a slower response. But then if we are exposed to that same pathogen the second time, then our body recognizes it and so responds much faster and much stronger. And so this is the basic principle of how immunity works. So these would have been things that were covered previously. Then going into, well, today the topic would be the history of vaccines. And again, I chose this because, as Katie mentioned, we have these historical features. Which is actually one of the things I really enjoyed about writing this text, is because it allowed me to go and dig into things that I didn't know as much. Having taught for over a dozen years, I know a lot of the basic biology, but some of these historical sequences were kind of fun and exciting and new. So went through and kind of looked at what is the history of vaccines. Here we're looking at smallpox is really where this all started out. So this is a little girl in Bangladesh who has smallpox, which is a very virulent disease. It spreads by aerosols. causes these open sores that you see. And when the sores are open, then the child or individual is contagious. But once they scab over, they're not. Now, the problem with smallpox is it had a very high death rate. 20 to 60% of those infected would die. But those who would live, they could have side effects. Some would be blind, but they would then be immune to the disease. So this idea of, well, maybe we can protect, right? Prior to smallpox, there was a practice called inoculation, where they would actually take some of the substance and inject it into the skin of the person to help protect them. And while that did help and improve, there was a risk associated with it. So in Boston back in 1721, there was an outbreak of smallpox, and they did this. They took smallpox, essentially kind of the pus, the fluid from the sore, and they would inject it into people, and the death rate went from 14% down to 2% for those who were inoculated. So it did work, but was not without its risks. So Edward Jenner is the one who's credited with vaccines, and he, of course, knew about this ancient practice of inoculation, but he kind of took a slightly different approach. An English doctor in 1796. He knew that dairy maids, these ladies that milk cows, would not get smallpox. So that was an observation that he made. So this kind of goes back to the idea of the cycle of scientific enterprise. But they would get something called cowpox, which was similar, but it's not as deadly. So he thought, well, maybe this can give protection. So he decided essentially to do an experiment. He took this dairy maid, her name was Sarah Nelms, and this is a sketch of her hand where she had the smallpox sores on it. So he took some of the sample from that, and he actually injected it into an 8-year-old boy with the parents' permission. And the boy did get a little bit sick for a short time. 2 months later, he then inoculated the same boy with the actual smallpox as opposed to the cowpox. And the boy didn't get sick at all. And so this was kind of the beginning of the idea of a natural vaccination. And the smallpox vaccination actually led to the complete eradication of smallpox worldwide in 1977, which we haven't been able to do with many diseases, but smallpox was one of them. But that kind of gives you just a quick look at how I might go through that. Again, that was very truncated, but I try and use the main ideas from the text, the figures from the text, reinforce ideas. I try and kind of go back to things that we covered before, make those connections. And then as Katie says, I would then assign questions for them to work through that material. So once everyone's gone home via email or Moodle or some of these online learning managing systems, then I can say, here's some homework questions for today. They're expected to then send those back to me. I will grade them and give them feedback within, usually I try 24 hours, to reinforce what they're learning, make sure what they're learning is correct so that those they're learning the proper information. The other thing that I tend to do, because we meet once a week, is always begin with a quiz, as Katie does too, a weekly quiz, which will cover the previous material. So they have, usually 2 homework assignments based on the material we covered in that lecture. And then when we meet again, I'll give them a short, maybe 5-question quiz, following Novare style, the open-ended answers as opposed to multiple choice. That gets them to kind of think more critically about that and just see how they're learning. Exams would then kind of follow along. And in our setting, because I have such limited time, I usually kind of have the parents proctor those. So I send the exam directly to the parents and say, hey, you're in charge of making sure your student does this in an ethical way. Please send it back, when they finished, just to optimize the time we have together. So that's just another way of maybe doing it with the co-op type setting. If you're just a homeschool parent with a single child that you're working with, or 2 children, you could kind of maybe adapt that in different ways. But those are kind of two ideas.
Thank you both. That was a great overview, and I think gave us a lot of perspective into what actually the book, how it's structured and how you might teach it. There's certainly a lot of flexibility there to suit everyone's needs. Okay, let's jump into the Apprentice's Companion because I really am excited for y'all to share that. And I know, Katie, you have it to share with everyone, right, on your screen.
I
So
do.
Katie's going to put that up and just walk us through about a little bit of that. Let's just spend a few minutes on this, on the Apprentice's Companion, and then we're going to jump to one more question before we go to Q&A. Okay, Katie.
Okay, sounds good. So this is the digital version, and we call them activities instead of experiments because some of them are shorter activities. Some of them are longer, more traditional experiments. This first one is just go outside and observe a plant and make really close, careful observations. So that's a practice that as biologists, we should be in the habit of observing more closely. But you can see there's space in here. There's questions that the student should answer right in the book, and then a space for a sketch that they'll make of their plant. And then just really critical thinking questions to think about what they've observed. And then an optional addition to that is to go outside at different times of the year and observe that same plant and see how it's changed with the seasons. And then these activities, they really align with the text. So we have maybe about 3 on average activities per chapter, 2 shorter ones and a longer one. They're not always exactly the same time frame, but we give you estimated times here. And so you can see there's objectives for each one. We'll give you corresponding sections of the textbook that this is meant to go with. There will be questions for the student to answer to just recall previous knowledge. And then, of course, all the materials that are required. And then places for the students to work. So some of the protocols are more open-ended. You can see that in this one, the student needs to, or the group of students needs to come up with their own experimental protocol. We don't do that hardly ever except here. We have space for graphs. And yeah, so we have about 15 activities done already. We have several of them will be dependent on a microscope. So your student should have a good microscope ready to go. A lot of prepared slide activities, and many of the other activities rely on household materials. So we do osmosis using eggs, and experiments with food coloring and water for diffusion, making solutions with sugar or salt. But we have all these materials that you need delineated. We'll have a spreadsheet with the cost associated with that. And we try to think about, what would the student need for chemistry the following year, and try to, streamline that as much as possible. So this is the Apprentice's Companion.
Thank you. Thanks for that quick overview of that book. And as you can see, we're trying to make it very visually interesting for the students. There's a lot of little other little nuggets where we bring in integration as well. There's some, like, poetry in there. There's a great poem about a microscope. So just bringing in some other things that are enriching the study of science. Yeah, there's a G.K. Chesterton quote. There's a poem right here, a G.K. Chesterton poem. So again, points of integration, and they're not like things that the student would be quizzed over or anything like that, but just enriching material. Let's see. Okay, we're going to jump to our last question here before we take a few minutes for some Q&A. Remember, please, you can use the chat box for your Q&A questions if you want us to answer something that you have on your mind. And Jeffrey is still going through and answering some of your questions now that can be answered without our live Q&A session just in the chat box. So I love how y'all are using that. Let's go to evolution, as I know this is something that is probably on many of your minds. We want to give Katie and Heather a chance to describe how evolution is addressed in this book and the thought process behind that presentation.
Do you want to start, Heather?
Sure, where to begin? This, of course, was a huge conversation that we continue to have throughout the entire process of writing this text, because we know that we have people interested in it who come from all kinds of backgrounds and who take different points on what I like to see as a continuum in terms of the evolution creation question. We all came to the table, though, with the same understanding: one, that God created the world, and that the Bible is true, and two, that evolution is true. Now, the question there is, well, what do we mean by evolution? And so we devote quite a bit of time to that question. And what does that mean? What does it mean from a science view? How are we going to define that in our text? And then we slowly kind of walk through kind of the different levels, you could say, of that. So we talk a lot about natural selection. We talk about mutations. We talk about speciation, that is how species is formed. And then we get into the larger evolutionary ideas, which is often referred to as macroevolution, and some of the science that's out there that supports that idea. But we wanted to give a very robust understanding of that, because it is what you find in science. It is what we see in biology. And if anyone is going to pursue science or the study of biology, then they need to have a good understanding of that area. But we also try to make it very open, in the sense that we didn't want to dictate your views on it. So we really tried hard to walk a fine line on this subject, which is really hard to do, and say, well, here's what we know. Now you can, interpret that as you will. So we really tried to do that. And what was interesting in our conversation is Katie and I aren't necessarily completely lined up in where we stand on this. And that actually really, I think, added to it, because we were able to have conversations about it, and kind of edit each other's work and try and neutralize some of our biases, which I think helped. And what I found most interesting is when we went through the review process, we actually had some reviewers that thought we were too far on one side, and other reviewers who thought we were too far on the other. And I said to John, we nailed it, John. We're right in the middle. So that was kind of the overall approach. And I know some people will think we're too far one way and some too far the other, but we really wanted to allow the freedom for people to come to it and say, well, okay, I can understand that, I can agree with that, and to allow the freedom for them to kind of land where they wanted to land. But Katie, what do you have to add, I guess?
Sure, I think that's a great intro to this topic. And yeah, the subject of evolution is so controversial, and it's probably one of the reasons why maybe you chose to homeschool, or just even the word can give us a visceral reaction sometimes. And so one thing is we try to be very careful to define our terms in the book. And so when we say theory of evolution, this is what we mean. And even, yeah, so evolution is a theory, right? Talking about the cycle of scientific enterprise from the very beginning of the book, and having that concept be weaved throughout is really helpful when we're talking about evolution, because the way that life changes over time, that is a scientific theory. And so you can kind of avoid, as a teacher, coming from it from that point of view, because my students are going to be on all ends of the spectrum of what viewpoint do they take about how it fits together. I can be very neutral by saying, well, it's a theory. Let's talk about the scientific cycle of enterprise, and what evidence is there behind this theory? What facts are there to support this theory? And can this theory change in the future? And the answer is yes, it could. There are aspects that are controversial even among scientists who aren't even Christians. And I mean, it's a hot topic. It's a hot, some of the aspects of it are rapidly changing as we speak. And that was one of the really exciting parts, writing this, delving into those hot areas of research. So in my teaching, I don't want my students to know if I have an opinion or a viewpoint. That's not my job to give them that bias. My job is to teach them science. And when we wrote this book, we really tried to come from that viewpoint, that this is a theory. So we use the cycle of scientific enterprise. Now, what we're not controversial about, rather, is that God did create the world, and giving glory to God is throughout this textbook. Previously, Heather and I had a discussion about how this relates to classical education. And I know many of you are classical educators. and how in classical education we often delve into art and we study different pieces of art, and that inevitably would lead you to learning more about the artist and that artist's life and why they created this piece of art the way they did. And even the techniques that they used might give you insight into who this person is that created this work of art. Well, the study of biology is really the ultimate art study, because there is an artist who created all this, but his techniques might vary. You know, he might have been very meticulous in some areas of the creation and placing things one by one, like pointillism, or it might have been more like Jackson Pollock, you know, throwing paint at the wall. And that's still beautiful and it still follows the laws of physics, but it looks very different. So there's a lot of wiggle room in discussing these different biological techniques that God might have used to create different things, but we are unambiguous that he is the creator.
Thank you. That is great. And of course, that is, you know, that is just the brief overview of that question. We are going to be publishing a blog in a few weeks that is a more in-depth interview with both Katie and Heather. And some of these things will be addressed in some more detail, specifically classical education and how this textbook pairs with classical education and even the role of science in classical education. Okay, so let's see. Again, let me remind you that you can drop questions in the chat box. We have just a few minutes here. We'll try to wrap up in a appropriate time frame for everyone. And we are really thankful for Katie and Heather spending their time with us together today. So I do want to be mindful of your time. Let's see. We do have a question about young Earth and old Earth perspectives. Let's see. Let me see if I can kind of throw this out. Does the book guide the student and teacher to have a successful discussion or debate on the origins topic? And then the follow-up question is especially to engage both young Earth and old Earth perspectives. Any thoughts on that?
We don't go into a whole lot of detail. Well, I guess there's two questions there. So I noticed that Jeffrey replied to that there's not currently a guide. I think it's a great idea. Of course, ours are just two perspectives in a whole milieu of ideas on this topic. But in terms of the young Earth, old Earth in this text, we don't go into a whole lot of detail. I think there are other texts by Novare that maybe address that in more depth. We do talk about the idea briefly at the very beginning of the chapter, but one thing, and this is completely my opinion, I'll throw out there on this one, is that in terms of the young Earth, old Earth, I see that as almost a separate question, because I think that it's very possible for a scientist to say old Earth is true, and we have evidence to support the old Earth. But that doesn't mean I automatically have to accept the theory of evolution in its complete form. Now, obviously, if you were to accept evolution in its complete form, you would have to accept old Earth, but they don't have to be connected. And so that's just one thing I like to articulate. But again, that's my opinion, not necessarily that of Novare's or the Classical Academic Press.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. You know, I love how you said it's a separate discussion, because in some of what I've read about a young Earth viewpoint, there is room for evolution within that framework, like kind of a hyper evolution, and maybe I'm misunderstanding that, but it really is two separate questions. With regard to the textbook, we do have a section on the fossil record and the history of life on Earth. And so as a teacher, you could choose to cover that in whatever way you want. You could have a class discussion about, I would suggest just bringing it back to the cycle of scientific enterprise. What evidence is there for this? What evidence is there for that? And just, you know, creating a culture of respect in your classroom and acknowledging that people do have different opinions on this, and that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you not a Christian. We need to have charity and, you know, liberty to disagree about things that are not central issues. So, but the information is in there about the fossil record and the history of life on Earth.
Thank you. We have a good question about homeschoolers and doing the activities. So can we come back to that? I know we talked about the Apprentice's Companion and how we might address or teach the book with maybe a 1-day-a-week class. Let's come back to experiments or activities. Can you address how many you might do in a homeschool or a co-op setting, and then also how to cut costs? Because I know that's always that is always on people's minds, especially this year in a sort of a crazy economic setting. So thoughts on that?
So, well, I'll just jump in. I did teach a homeschool co-op for many years. So number one, you don't have to do every experiment. We're going to have about 39 experiments in this companion. And if you're only meeting 1 day a week, you might choose to do one per chapter and choose the one that has the least expensive materials or the ones that you have on hand already. And I think even doing that would be a great experience for your students. Do you want to add to that, Heather?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that exact same thing. In putting this together, we wanted to give a lot of options, but it was no way saying you must do all 39 exercise or whatever it's going to be in order to have a full experience. Just to give you maybe some perspective, as a college professor in my intro biology class that every student takes, we meet about 11 times for lab, and that's it for the whole semester. So I think, as Katie said, if you've got 12 activities in there, they've been exposed to it, and that would be fine. Some of these activities, as we mentioned earlier, are very short and simple and sweet and can be done in 15, 20, 30 minutes. Others are more drawn out. And we have tried to keep in mind kind of costs. So, can we do it in a kitchen? Some of them, yes, some of them, no. We've tried to make notes in the Apprentice Companion in the teacher's notes section of maybe substitutions you could have. I think some of the main equipment, the microscope is a big one. Although you might, if you don't have access to one or don't want to spend the $200 or whatever it is to get one, you might check around and see if there's a local high school or a local college that might have some kind of checkout program where you could borrow it for a time, something of that sort. We use a scale. Kitchen scales sometimes work, sometimes don't work, depending on the lever accuracy that we're needing in a particular experiment. So we have recommended one from the home science tools. I'm trying to think of the other kind of big equipment items. I think those are really the two main ones. And then it's things like test tubes, beakers. We try not to use a lot of chemicals so that they're easy to dispose of these things. So we do a DNA extraction, which really you can use with mostly just things around your kitchen. The egg osmosis one is fun. So we have tried to keep that in mind as we've written these, and some we just can't get away from needing some technical equipment, but others we can. So I think Katie's suggestion is very good. Find the ones that work well for you and go with those.
Yeah, and the things that you can't easily get at the grocery store, you can get from home science tools, like especially your specimens for dissection. We're going to be going with a kit that has several of those specimens together. So you should be able to easily obtain what you need to obtain and, pick and choose what works for you.
We are, John Mays is actually on us to try and get a full list of supplies to him here in the next week or two. It's on my list of things to do. So hopefully we'll have that. It may not be exactly correct as we're still writing labs and activities, but at least it would give kind of a general idea of what you would need.
Great. Thank you both. I appreciate all of the excellent crowdsourcing there is going on in this chat box. There's a lot of people answering each other's questions and being helpful, which is great. Oh, this is a good question. Somebody's asking transitioning into this curriculum from a different curriculum. How would you, do you have any comments on that? How difficult would that be?
I think they should be able to do it. And it's, some schools will be doing biology first in the high school sequence, even though the official Novare position is to do physics first. And so when there are instances of needing to know something from physics or needing to know something from chemistry, the way we set the book up covers those topics first. So really, a student needs to be able to read well and to write their questions, and what they need to know is there in the book.
That's great. That's so helpful. And yes, I did want to point out that we're going to have another webinar next week that John will give, and this is going to be more of a general science, Novare science webinar, and he's going to address a few more of these questions in detail, like the sequencing that we would recommend for high school science, and some other things like that. So that's another resource for you if you want to join us. That'll be free, and there will be a sign up email going out about that next week. A few more resources just before we wrap up here. You can find, I put in the link a few minutes ago to the general biology program, which is on classicalacademicpress.com. You can find all of those resources there. Again, we do not supply the lab kits ourselves, but you can go to Home Science Tools for that. That's excellent for both small school environments and homeschoolers. They provide smaller quantities of things. Of course, if you're a larger school, you may be buying those in larger quantities. And then also, you can always email us at science@classicalsubjects.com. And that is a great way to contact us with, somebody asked about if you find an error, where do you report that? You can email us at that email address, or email us with questions. So just a few more resources for you. Let's see. Any last questions? I feel like we've addressed most of them, and I'm sorry if I am missing something that someone added. I do want to go ahead and start wrapping up now. Jeffrey, thank you so much for monitoring our chat box and answering so many questions. But again, Katie and Heather, do you have any last words for us? We really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. One thing I wanted to just comment on is kind of trying to scroll through some of the questions as well. We have put a lot in this text. It's, I think, very complete. So if you're teaching it and you feel like, gosh, I don't know if the student can really grasp all these concepts, that's okay. Frequently when I'm teaching my students, these students who have to take biology, they're not science inclined, I will, dare I say, water down some of the topics and just give a very brief survey, you know, so that they understand things. That's okay. I think my goal is always, for people who are not maybe science inclined, is to find out that science doesn't have to be scary, that it can be fun and enjoyable. And so I really think at this level, I'd rather them come away understanding a handful of concepts really well than trying to get bogged down in all these details. So use it, you know, as you see fit. And if you, as, you know, teacher mom, homeschool mom, like, I don't even understand, that's okay. If you can get the big idea right across and just kind of understand that concept, then that would be a good, right? And so just kind of build on that as we move forward. So don't feel like you have to get every single detail in. I know I never do in the college semester. We always run out of time, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, as from a classroom teacher perspective, you know, we have so many demands on our time, especially maybe not this year, but in a typical year, there's like events and rallies and chapels, and then you lose this class period here and this class period there. And I struggle to get through a whole textbook in a year, even though the textbook is designed to potentially be able to be finished in a year. And if you're in that situation, you can cut, like, you know what your students need, you know what standards you need to cover. And if there are particular topics within a chapter that are too difficult for your particular group of students, you know, maybe going back to the standards questions list at the beginning and focusing on those, and maybe like cutting out several of those questions, saying we're not going to cover that question. It would still give you a very comprehensive list and still give your students a very rigorous education.
That's great. Thank you. And I just saw one more comment about someone speaking about being in school in person, and then maybe having to switch back to online or vice versa, and hoping this program would work in that setting. And I would say yes, it does. We do have schools that are teaching general biology online. because they're an online school, not just because many of us are in that situation right now. So I would say yes. And another thing is that in many of these science webinars that we've done before, one common thought is that you can find almost any kind of demonstration online. You can find almost any sort of scientific demonstration on YouTube. And so if you're in a situation where you cannot do physical labs with your students, there are a lot of things that you can look up another scientist performing some kind of experiment that would be a good demonstration for the type of thing that you're studying in the book. So that's another idea. Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Our questions are sort of rolling to a slow here. But we so appreciate your time, Heather and Katie. Thank you so much for being willing to chat with us today, for sharing yourselves and your work with all of us. And again, if you have more questions, you can contact us at science@classicalsubjects.com. You can find all of these resources at classicalacademicpress.com. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to be here.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks. And again, we will send out a link to a recording. So if you didn't catch the whole thing, or if you want to catch it again later, we will send that out to you via email. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day.